No one builds monuments for boys who are supposed to disappear. On a cold winter morning in colonial America, a child was born into a life so small, so deliberately erased that history itself tried to pretend he never existed. No birth record, no official name, no promise that he would live long enough to matter. He was born enslaved. His mother was allowed to see him only at night, after working herself to exhaustion all day. She would walk miles through darkness just to hold him for a few stolen moments before dawn forced her away again. By sunrise, she would be gone, vanishing back into a system designed to erase love, memory, and identity. The boy would grow up barely knowing her face. This was not unusual. This was the system working exactly as intended. What was unusual, what would later terrify the most powerful men in America, was that this boy learned how to read. That single act would make him one of the most dangerous men in American history. His name was Frederick Douglass, and America was never supposed to hear it. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, he would later rename himself, was born in February 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. The exact day was never recorded. Enslaved people were not granted birthdays, they were granted labor. From the beginning, his life followed a brutal logic: separation, silence, control. He did not know who his father was. Like many enslaved children, he suspected the truth but was never allowed to confirm it. His father was likely white, possibly the very man who owned him. That knowledge, unspoken but ever present, hung over his childhood like a poison cloud. When Frederick was still a small child, he was taken from his grandmother, the woman who had raised him, and left alone on a plantation. He later described that moment not as sadness, but as something colder: confusion. No explanation, no goodbye, just abandonment dressed up as routine. This was how the system trained obedience, by teaching children that attachment was dangerous. At around the age of 8, Frederick was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld. This move, intended to benefit his owners, would instead ignite a revolution inside one boy's mind. Sophia Auld had never owned a slave before. She was kind, curious, unaware of the unwritten rules. One day, she began teaching Frederick the alphabet. It was an innocent act, a human one. It was also forbidden. When her husband discovered what she was doing, he reacted with fury, not because it was illegal, but because it was dangerous. "If you teach that boy to read," Hugh Auld said, "there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave." Those words struck Frederick like lightning. For the first time, the system revealed its secret. Literacy was power, and power was exactly what slavery could not survive. Sophia never taught him another letter. Fear replaced kindness. She transformed before his eyes, proof that slavery did not only destroy the enslaved, it corrupted everyone it touched. But it was already too late. Frederick had seen the door. He learned in secret. White children in the streets of Baltimore became his teachers. He traded bread for lessons. He studied discarded newspapers. He memorized letters scratched into wood and chalked onto brick walls. Words unlocked ideas. Ideas unlocked rage. And rage, controlled, sharpened, disciplined, became resolve. As Frederick read newspapers, speeches, and political debates, a horrifying realization formed. America spoke endlessly of liberty while holding millions in chains. The contradiction was not a mistake. It was policy. The Founding Fathers wrote about freedom with one hand while signing bills of sale with the other. Churches preached salvation while blessing the whip. Courts upheld justice while enforcing bondage. This hypocrisy burned itself into Frederick's consciousness. And once a man sees the lie, he can never fully return to silence. When Frederick was sent back to the plantation as a teenager, his literacy made him dangerous. So they tried to break him. He was sent to Edward Covey, a man known as a slave breaker. Covey specialized in destroying the spirit, not through constant brutality, but through unpredictability. He attacked without warning. He watched constantly. He made resistance feel pointless. For months, Frederick endured beatings, starvation, exhaustion, until one day, something snapped. When Covey attacked him again, Frederick fought back. It was not a quick scuffle. It was a 2-hour battle in a barn, fist slamming, bodies crashing, breath tearing from lungs. And then, silence. Covey stopped. He never whipped Frederick again. That moment would later be remembered by Frederick as the day he reclaimed his manhood, not legally, not socially, but internally. "I was a changed being after that fight," he wrote. "I was nothing before. I was a man now." The system had failed, and it knew it. Frederick escaped slavery in 1838, disguised as a sailor, carrying borrowed papers, riding north on trains and boats where discovery meant death. When he reached New York, he was free, but not safe. The fugitive slave laws meant capture was always possible. Slave catchers roamed freely, empowered by federal authority. Freedom was fragile. But Frederick did not hide. He spoke. His voice, measured, precise, devastating, cut through American complacency like a blade. When he began telling his story publicly, white audiences were stunned. Many had believed enslaved people incapable of intellect, eloquence, or political thought. Frederick Douglass shattered that lie by standing calmly at a podium and dismantling it word by word. Some accused him of being a fraud. "He's too intelligent," they said. "He must be reading someone else's work." So he wrote his own life story, and America could no longer look away. By the 1840s, Frederick Douglass had become the most powerful black voice in the United States. Former slaves were not supposed to challenge presidents. Douglass did. Former slaves were not supposed to influence policy. Douglass did. Former slaves were not supposed to redefine what America meant by "we the people." Douglass did that too, and the country would never forgive or forget it. But the most shocking part of his story had not happened yet, because Frederick Douglass was about to confront Abraham Lincoln and force the United States to choose between its ideals and its survival. By the time Frederick Douglass first met Abraham Lincoln, America was already bleeding. The Civil War had torn the nation in half. Cities burned, families shattered, fields turned into graveyards. Yet even as men died by the tens of thousands, the question that truly mattered remained unanswered. Was this war about saving the Union or ending slavery? Abraham Lincoln knew the truth, but he feared it. And Frederick Douglass was no longer willing to be patient. Douglass had become famous almost by accident. He didn't speak with anger. He didn't shout. He didn't beg for sympathy. He spoke with precision. Every sentence landed like a verdict. White audiences who had never questioned slavery sat frozen as Douglass dismantled the myths they had lived with all their lives. He didn't ask them to feel guilty. He forced them to think. That was far more dangerous. Southern newspapers labeled him an enemy of civilization. Northern moderates called him too extreme. Some abolitionists even wished he would soften his tone. Douglass refused. because he understood something most Americans didn't. Slavery would not end through politeness. It would end through pressure. When the Civil War began in 1861, Douglass saw an opportunity and a betrayal. Black men rushed to enlist. They were turned away. The same nation willing to let black bodies die as slaves refused to let them fight as soldiers. Douglass was furious. In speeches across the North, he challenged Lincoln directly. "How can a war for liberty be fought with enslaved men watching from the sidelines?" he asked. "How can America demand sacrifice while denying citizenship?" These weren't rhetorical questions. They were indictments, and Lincoln heard them. Abraham Lincoln admired Frederick Douglass, but admiration didn't equal courage. Lincoln feared losing the border states. He feared alienating white voters. He feared pushing the country too fast. Douglass saw this hesitation as moral failure. He didn't write polite letters. He went to the White House. The first time Frederick Douglass walked into the White House, guards tried to stop him. He was black. He was uninvited. He was not supposed to be there. Douglass refused to move. "I wish to see the president," he said calmly. Something in his voice, authority, certainty, made them hesitate. Lincoln received him. And for the first time in American history, a formerly enslaved man sat across from the President of the United States as an equal in intellect and moral clarity. Douglass did not flatter Lincoln. He criticized him directly. He told Lincoln that delaying emancipation was costing lives, that refusing black soldiers was weakening the Union, that history would not be kind to half measures. Lincoln listened, really listened. Later, Lincoln would say that Douglass was the most meritorious man to ever speak with him on the subject of slavery. But admiration still wasn't action, so Douglass escalated. When the Emancipation Proclamation was announced in 1863, white America celebrated. Douglass did not. He called it a moral milestone, but also a deeply flawed document. Why? Because it freed slaves only in Confederate territories, not in loyal slave states. Freedom, Douglass argued, was being treated as a military tactic instead of a human right. Many accused him of ingratitude. Douglass didn't care. He understood something essential. Power never gives more than it is forced to give. Then came the question that would reshape America forever. Should black men be allowed to fight? Douglass answered without hesitation. Yes. Not just allowed, encouraged. He toured the country recruiting black soldiers, including his own sons. "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter U.S., Douglass said, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Over 180,000 black men would eventually fight for the Union. Their blood sealed America's future. But even as black soldiers fought and died, injustice followed them into uniform. They were paid less. They were given worse supplies. They were assigned the most dangerous tasks. When Confederate forces captured black soldiers, they were often executed on the spot. Douglass demanded justice. And once again, he went straight to Lincoln. This time, the conversation was darker. Douglass warned Lincoln that if black soldiers continued to be treated as expendable, recruitment would collapse. Lincoln admitted the truth. The nation wasn't ready to fully accept black equality. Douglass responded coldly. "Then the nation is not ready to survive." Those words haunted Lincoln. When Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, Frederick Douglass felt grief, but not surprise. America had always punished men who forced it to face itself. At Lincoln's funeral, Douglass stood among the mourners knowing that the future was uncertain and possibly worse. He was right. Reconstruction was betrayed. Former Confederates returned to power. Black codes replaced chains. Terror replaced law. Douglass fought on. He challenged presidents. He exposed lynching. He demanded civil rights decades before they became politically convenient. And America resisted him every step of the way. Then came the moment that revealed how deeply he had changed the nation. In 1876, at the unveiling of the Freedmen's Monument to Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass was asked to speak. Some expected praise. They got truth. Douglass honored Lincoln, but reminded the audience that Lincoln was not a saint, and emancipation was not charity. "It was a necessity," Douglass said, "and justice delayed is justice denied." The crowd was uneasy. History was not supposed to speak back. Frederick Douglass would die in 1895. But his words refused to die with him. They echoed through the civil rights movement, through Supreme Court rulings, through protests, marches, and classrooms. He had forced America to confront its contradiction, and in doing so, reshaped its identity. Not with a gun, not with a crown, but with truth sharpened into a weapon. When the war ended, America congratulated itself. The chains were broken. The Union was saved. The Constitution amended itself into something that looked, on paper, like justice. And then the country grew tired. Freedom, Americans decided, had been given quickly enough. Quality could wait. Frederick Douglass saw the danger immediately. He had lived long enough to recognize a familiar pattern. When power feels threatened, it changes tactics instead of surrendering control. Slavery was dead. Something worse was being born. In the South, white supremacy reorganized itself. No longer protected by law, it disguised itself as order, tradition, and state rights. Night riders replaced overseers. Courtrooms replaced auction blocks. Terror became policy. Black men were arrested for vagrancy, fined for unemployment, imprisoned for existing. Once jailed, they were leased to private companies, forced labor by another name. Freedom without protection was not freedom. It was exposure. Frederick Douglass spoke against this betrayal with a fury sharpened by experience. He warned the nation that reconstruction without enforcement was surrender. The compromise with injustice was simply injustice with better manners. Presidents smiled, then ignored him. Douglass had become inconvenient. He was no longer the inspirational former slave who made white audiences feel progressive just by applauding him. He was a living accusation, proof that America knew better and chose otherwise. Newspapers began to downplay his influence. Politicians praised him in public, dismissed him in private. Some white reformers suggested it might be time for Douglass to step aside and let healing begin. Douglass understood exactly what they meant. Silence. But silence had never been his language. He continued to write, to lecture, to confront. When lynching spread like wildfire across the South, Douglass refused to soften his words. He named it what it was: terrorism. He exposed the lies used to justify it. He printed statistics. He told stories. America hated him for it. It preferred myths. By the 1880s, younger activists emerged, many inspired by Douglass, some impatient with him. They wanted faster change, louder protests, new tactics. Douglass welcomed them. He had never believed he was the destination. He was a bridge. But even bridges are eventually abandoned once crossed. What shocked America most was not that Douglass had once been enslaved. It was that he refused to remain grateful. He did not thank the nation for his freedom. He demanded accountability for its failure. That made him dangerous until the very end. When Frederick Douglass died in 1895, the reaction was strangely muted. Yes, newspapers acknowledged his greatness. Yes, politicians issued respectful statements, but something was missing: urgency. The nation treated his death like the closing of a chapter rather than a warning left unread. And slowly, deliberately, his radicalism was sanded down. Schools taught him as a symbol, not a threat. Quotes were trimmed, speeches softened, the anger removed. America remembered the man. It forgot the message. But history has a habit of leaking through the cracks. In the early 20th century, Black intellectuals rediscovered Douglass's writings. His uncompromising insistence on full citizenship became fuel for a new generation. During the Civil Rights Movement, his words resurfaced, quoted in churches, pamphlets, and jail cells. Martin Luther King Jr. read him. Malcolm X studied him. They recognized something familiar. Douglass had understood that progress without pressure was illusion. Even today, his presence unsettles. Every time America argues about who belongs, who deserves rights, who gets protection under the law, Frederick Douglass is there, asking the same question he asked more than a century ago. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? It was never just about one holiday. It was about the gap between promise and practice. That gap still exists. Frederick Douglass did not live to see the America he imagined, but America has never been able to escape the America he demanded. He forced the nation to define itself, not once, but over and over again. And that is why his life changed American history. Not because he was perfect, not because he was polite, but because he refused to let the most powerful country on earth lie to itself without consequence. America likes its heroes quiet. It prefers them frozen in bronze, smiling, harmless, stripped of urgency. Heroes who belong to the past, not the present. Heroes who inspire pride without demanding change. Frederick Douglass refused to cooperate with that fantasy. Even in death, he would not stay still. After 1895, the United States entered a new century with an old sickness. Segregation hardened into law. Lynching became ritual. Black voices were pushed out of politics, out of education, out of public memory. And slowly, deliberately, Frederick Douglass was rewritten. Textbooks praised his escape but skipped his accusations. They admired his courage but ignored his fury. They taught him as an exception, proof that America worked, rather than as evidence that it had failed. The country found a way to celebrate him without listening to him. That was the compromise. But Douglass's words did not disappear. They waited. They waited in old newspapers, cracked leather-bound books, and forgotten speeches that still burned with clarity. They waited for a moment when America would once again claim to believe in itself and need to be reminded of the cost. That moment came again and again. When Black Americans demanded voting rights in the 1950s and 60s, Douglass's logic returned like a verdict long delayed. His insistence that citizenship must be enforced, not merely promised, echoed through courtrooms and marches. When civil rights leaders debated patience versus pressure, they were arguing a question Douglass had already answered a century earlier. He had warned them, justice delayed is justice denied. America had not listened then. It was being forced to listen now. What made Frederick Douglass uniquely dangerous, even today, was not his biography. It was his refusal to accept gradual morality. He did not believe oppression required time to die. He believed it required confrontation. That belief unsettles a nation built on compromise. Douglass understood something that modern America still struggles to admit. Neutrality always sides with power. He did not ask white Americans to feel bad. He asked them to take responsibility. And responsibility is far more frightening than guilt. Even now, politicians quote Douglass selectively. They borrow his patriotism and abandon his critique. They celebrate his belief in America while ignoring his warning about it. Because Douglass loved the country enough to hold it accountable. And accountability feels like accusation to those who benefit from the status quo. In one of his final speeches, Douglass said something that still hangs over American history like a challenge unfinished. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing a law of human behavior. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never has. It never will. Frederick Douglass did not change America by comforting it. He changed it by refusing to let it sleep. He forced the nation to confront its contradiction at moments when denial felt safer than truth. He walked into rooms he was not invited into, spoke words he was not supposed to speak, and claimed a voice he was never meant to have. And in doing so, he altered the moral direction of a continent. He began life as property. He ended it as conscience. That transformation terrified the powerful then, and it still does now, because it proves something America has never been able to forget: that the most dangerous man in the room is not the one with the most weapons, but the one who understands the truth and refuses to let go. Epilogue. Frederick Douglass once said he prayed not for freedom, but for fire. Fire to burn lies. Fire to expose hypocrisy. Fire to force change. That fire is still burning. And as long as America argues about who belongs, who deserves rights, and what freedom truly means, Frederick Douglass will never be finished with it.